They called it a victory. But the world saw it as a stain on the soul of the British Empire. In 1902 the Second Boer War ended. But not with triumph. With trauma. What happens when an empire wins a war but loses its humanity in the process? What cost is paid for dominance? And how did one of the most powerful nations in history find itself condemned on the global stage? This is the story of the war Britain wanted to forget. But the world would always remember. January to February 1902, a war without an end. In the rugged hills of South Africa, Boer fighters still resisted. Outnumbered, outgunned, but unbroken. The British Empire was locked in its third year of brutal war against two small Boer republics. But the war had changed. No longer fought on open fields but in shadows. Guerrilla raids replaced battles. Ambushes replaced armies. And in response, Britain unleashed fire. Villages were burned. Crops destroyed. And civilians, mostly women and children, were herded into camps. Camps that would become infamous. Marched the world watches in horror. Inside British-run concentration camps, death was silent but constant. Disease, hunger and despair took more lives than bullets ever could. Emily Hobhouse, a British humanitarian, traveled to South Africa. What she saw changed the world. And shamed an empire. She returned home not with weapons, but with words. Her reports ignited outrage in Britain and across Europe. Parliament argued. Newspapers raged. And the myth of British moral superiority cracked. April peace talks begin. Even as smoke still rose over scorched farms. Leaders met in secret. Lord Kitchener representing Britain. Louis Botha, Jan Smuts and others for the Boers. Could there be peace? Or would this war consume another year? Another generation? The Boers were weary. Their land destroyed. Their people dying. But they wanted dignity. Something to salvage from the ashes. May the Treaty of Vereeniging is signed. On May 31, 1902. The war officially ended. The Boer republics were absorbed into the British Empire. No independence. No autonomy. But Britain agreed to rebuild. To respect the Dutch language and culture. To offer amnesty. Black South Africans were excluded. Their future ignored. A silence that would echo into apartheid. June to July, the aftermath begins. Tens of thousands were dead. South Africa was broken. Families returned to ruins. Economies collapsed. And trust shattered. But something else had shifted. The world had seen the brutality behind the British banner. And the empire began to tremble. Not fall. Not yet. But tremble. August to October, a new chapter forms. The Boers may have lost the war. But they began building something new. Jan Smuts and Louis Botha. Former rebels. Now politicians. They organized. Rebuilt. Planted the seeds of a future South Africa. The British invested too. Railways. Schools. A vision of stability through infrastructure. The Union of South Africa was born 8 years later. But unity came with complications. November to December, the world reflects. The Boer War was over. But its impact was just beginning. The world had watched a small nation challenge an empire. And nearly survive. It saw how modern warfare now included civilians as casualties. How global opinion could shape policy. And how imperial confidence could falter under scrutiny. This war did not end colonialism. But it changed its nature. Key figures who shaped this moment. Lord Kitchener, the Iron General who scorched a country to end a war. Emily Hobhouse, the voice of conscience who stood against her own empire. Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, warriors turned builders of a divided future. Joseph Chamberlain, the strategist who designed an empire's expansion and bore its scars. Why this year matters? Because 1902 marked the end of a war but also the beginning of a reckoning. Britain won the Second Boer War. But it lost something deeper. Its claim to moral superiority. Its illusion of benevolent rule. This war foreshadowed the century ahead. World wars. Resistance movements. Civilian suffering as strategy. Guerrilla warfare became a blueprint. Human rights became a demand. South Africa would never forget. And neither would the world. 1902. The war ended. But the soul of the empire would never be the same. If this story opened your eyes to a war that shaped modern imperialism, subscribe to TimeLens. We bring history alive. 1 year at a time. One story at a time. Because history is not the past.